Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this Academy Update webinar. It's a sunny morning where I am, so hopefully this will be a harbinger of good times for the future as we move into the spring and hopefully towards the end of the pandemic. My name is Mike Farwell. I'm head of the Charities and Education team at James Cooper Kreston. I'm joined today by my partner colleague, Louise Holsworth. And behind the scenes, we have Lizzie Uzzell from our marketing team who will be dealing with the slides and the technology. We act for around 40 academies, and the purpose of this session is to update you on the Kreston Academies Benchmarking Report for this year, and I'll give you a bit more detail about how the report has been compiled a bit later. We're aiming for the session to run for around 30 minutes, and we've got a great turnout. On the webinar, one of the things that has arisen during the pandemic is we've seen that attendance at webinars has increased, and of course schools being closed at the moment, largely that sort of helps the attendance at these webinars. Certainly I'm sure that if we were running it after the 8th of March, the attendance would be a bit lower. In terms of housekeeping, you should see the slides on your screen. There's a facility to ask questions on your screen too, which we'll deal with at the end. After the webinar, you will receive a recording of the webinar. You will also receive a link to the benchmark report itself. I think many of you will have received the link in the past, and you will also receive the slides. So sort of a nice little pack for you to receive later on. So let's make a start. So in terms of the benchmark report itself, it covers around 300 academy trusts, around 1,400 schools across the country. There are, as well as our own clients, it also includes clients of other firms in the Kreston network across the country. I think it's fair to say, in terms of the year that we've had, it has been a remarkable year. The survey results are based on the accounts for the year to 1st of August 2020. Of course, next year's survey will also be a remarkable year because we will have a continued impact of the pandemic during a second accounting year. I think it's fair to say that those of you that have attended these webinars before will see that the numbers are very slightly down on the previous year. This partly reflects some consolidation in terms of movement into multi-academy trusts, but also reflects the fact that there was a 1-month extension on the filing date for accounts. So there are a few trusts who perhaps hadn't filed their accounts until finalised their accounts until towards the end of January, who aren't included in the survey. We were keen to work to the same schedule as we have done in the past, despite that extension of 1 month. The results are analysed by primary, secondary school and multi-academy trusts, and it's a useful way, I think, of you comparing yourself to other similar academies, depending on which category you're in. What I would say is, I think that in many ways the key thing is to get people thinking about how they can benchmark themselves against other academies and how they might do things differently, rather than just relying on a strict comparison. So that's the broad background to the report itself. I mean, in terms of the number of academy schools across the country, I mean, our survey covers well over 10% of all the academies in the country. So let's move on, looking at a bit more of the detail. In terms of the highlights, as I've said before, COVID-19, massive impact on the year. I think we used the phrase in the report, it's been a year like no other. As you all know, there have been huge operational challenges for schools in this period, and I think schools have been remarkably resilient in dealing with those. I'm actually a school governor myself and also a governor of a further education college, so I've seen some of these challenges in my roles there, although I must say I'm delighted I'm not having to deal with those on a day-to-day basis. So we've had challenges around the exams, for example, changing government advice, all the COVID-related matters to do with cleaning and testing, etc. So a hugely challenging year. Interestingly, one of the themes that comes out from the reports is that schools have generally an improved financial position compared to the previous year, and that applies to primary, secondary and maths. The most significant increase in performance are in the secondary schools. We'll explain the reasons for that a bit later. So in terms of a bit more detail, reductions in income have been a factor, particularly around lettings income. Most other income streams have held up reasonably well, but of course you haven't been able to rent facilities out. So schools that have a heavy reliance on that have had a big impact. But we've also seen some significant reductions in property-related costs, whether that's maintenance, property, energy, education and educational supplies, etc. So we have seen reductions in costs too. One other theme that's come through from the report is a reduction in supply staff costs. More than 70% of academies reported that. We have seen an investment in technology in the period. And we've also seen, I think, particularly perhaps those of you, not just the school leadership teams, but also at trustee and governor level, we have seen that decision making has been quite challenging in the absence of face-to-face meetings. And it will be interesting to see how that impacts on decision making, particularly in terms of trustee and governor meetings into the future. If we move on, Lizzie, onto the next slide. We have seen a slower growth overall in the sector in terms of the number of schools that are academies, but a bit of a growth in centralised trusts. That's largely driven by trusts which are working with primary schools, because of course the proportion of primary schools which are academies has generally historically been lagging a bit behind secondary schools. We've seen a fall in rebrokerage. This is where schools move between different multi-academy trusts, and there have been some interesting comparisons with the independent school sector, particularly around technology. I think, as we know, I think generally independent schools, of course, have greater resources and are able to more easily invest in technology. And of course, they have fee-paying parents who have been chasing them to make sure that they are paying for an education that they're happy with. Just as a point of interest, I think typically we have seen independent schools have been reducing their fees by typically around 10 to 20%, although some haven't reduced fees and some have reduced fees by more during the periods when the school has been closed. And some of them have been marketing and trying to attract new pupils to their schools by selling the message that they have great technology and are able to continue teaching very effectively. And I think, of course, hard-pressed parents are dealing with homeschooling sometimes have found that attractive. We've seen a reduced number of trusts with cumulative deficits, more of that later. And we have seen an increase in general annual grant pooling. Pooling is in a multi-academy trust where, rather than the schools keeping individual reserves, everything gets pooled into one pot. We haven't seen, whilst there's been an ability to do that for some years now, not many multi-academy trusts have actually used it, but we are now seeing a bit of traction there. We've also seen an increase in IT spend, expenditure plans into the future, and an acceptance that there will be more reliance on technology. And I think with lockdown since August 2020, there will be more strain on finances in the future, particularly around things like cleaning, etc. Now, during the webinar, we're going to launch a couple of polls just to get your thoughts on various things. So, Lizzie, if we can launch the first poll. So, this relates to technology expenditure plans for the next 12 months. So, in terms of the academy that you are involved in, perhaps you can look and see if you can select one of these options in terms of what your technology expenditure plans are for the next months. Are you planning a very significant increase, some increase, no increase or reduction? So if I can ask you all to vote, and we'll give you a little bit of time to vote. It'll be interesting to see what the results are here. Just give you a few seconds. So there we get the results of the poll. So around 75% are seeing some increase, 20% a very significant increase, and 5% no increase. So some interesting, the numbers there, of course, are rounded. Quite interesting to see that. I think that mirrors largely what we see in our report, although I think possibly perhaps more of a focus there on expenditure on technology into the future than was indicated by the survey. So let's move on now to the financial position. We've talked about COVID-19 challenges. I think one thing that we have seen during the COVID-19 period is that there have been massive challenges placed on schools in terms of dealing with a constantly changing environment. And I think there was evidence from the survey that multi-academy trusts have found that slightly easier to deal with, having a central team who can perhaps focus on some of these issues and roll that out across a wider number of schools. In terms of the actual numbers, always difficult, of course, with academies to work out, where you're referring to surpluses or deficits. But if we look at sort of the in-year position, excluding capital income, we'll see a trend there from 2018 through to 2020. 2019 was impacted by some additional government funding, but we see the figures for 2020 show a significant improvement on the previous year. I think that is really most noticeable with secondary schools, which perhaps were closed for longer. I think primary schools, obviously less of an increase, and I think with multi-academy trust, where there's an increasing focus on primary schools, there the increase is also less marked, but still, an increase. I think the other factor to do with multi-academy trusts is historically they have been better at generating additional income, so they have perhaps been more affected by COVID-19 than some of the single academy trusts. So if we move on to some further detail around financial position, so supply costs saving by 70% of schools, and it'll be interesting to see what schools do there into the futures. Many schools are looking at how they deal with supply staff issues into the future. 85% planning to increase IT spend into the future, and of course that's mirrored by what you said on the online poll that we've just done. As a result of the surpluses for the period, only 5% of trusts are now in a cumulative deficit compared to 8% in the previous year and 8% in I think the year before that. Of course, from September 20, there are some additional costs, I think extra cleaning costs, IT spend, etc. And whilst there is some additional funding for some of these costs, I think we have been seeing that schools have really been struggling sometimes to access some of these funds, and some of the claims haven't been successful. And I think the criteria for 2021 are slightly harder. So it'll be interesting to see when we do the survey next year how many schools have actually been successful at covering some of these additional costs. I think we have seen, to a degree, some pessimism in forecasts through to 2023. Of course, there's great uncertainty around funding generally, and of course, the impact of COVID-19 on government finances will have an impact here. I think an interesting feature of academy forecasting is generally that actual results turn out better than academies have actually forecast. I mean, I think in terms of forecasting, I think the generally perceived wisdom, it's better to be cautious than optimistic, but certainly that's borne out by the experience in the academy sector. If we move on to the balance sheet, not surprising, as a result of the surpluses that we referred to earlier, there has been an increase in bank balances and reserves driven by the impact of the pandemic. I think we have seen that in terms of funding, there is an increase in the capital grants per pupil, but we have seen a bit of a reduction in capital expenditure. I think there are two reasons for that. One is that some of the SIF funding, which previously had been announced in early April, the funding for that the announcement of that was delayed until June, and so as a result, schools were unable to spend the money by the 31st of August. And the other has just been the impact of COVID-19 in terms of delaying projects, in terms of building projects with appropriate safeguards, etc., and just difficulties in managing projects in a lockdown period. So we'll see capital expenditure increase in 2020, partly a result of the increases in IT expenditure that we referred to earlier, but also because some of the building projects, have been delayed. In terms of technology, I mean, some of the challenges remain. I think there is some old technology around. I think generally with schools, sometimes the IT equipment is getting a bit on the old side and sometimes a bit older than you might see in the commercial sector. Unfortunately, we're seeing more cyber attacks. This applies not just to schools, but across the wider society as a whole. In some locations, I think there are some challenges with broadband in terms of use of technology. And sometimes in multi-academy trusts, you see issues to do with legacy systems from some of the schools joining a multi-academy trust. But I think it's quite clear that with planned IT investment and acceptance that technology will be more important in the future, that schools do have an appropriate IT strategy. Of course, the government has announced more laptops. I think hopefully there'll be 1 million more laptops supplied through the spring. That was certainly the plan. hopefully it will be as successful as the vaccination programs it seems to be. In terms of local government pension scheme deficits, we have seen, broadly speaking, it does vary, of course, we have seen increases in deficits in the last 2 years, I think, generally speaking, although sometimes there are some variations. I think the next valuations of the LGPS schemes are due 2022, so we may see some increases in contributions through to 2023. Of course, it's worth mentioning that whilst sometimes these LGPS deficits are one of the biggest numbers on your balance sheet, usually the second biggest number after fixed assets, there isn't any expectation that will be an immediate requirement for you to cover these deficits. But of course, what it does mean if there is a deficit is that you will be paying more contributions into the future, perhaps over a 20 or 25-year period. Finally, before I hand over to Louise, also increase in teachers' pension scheme contributions. Many of you will know that in September 19, these contributions went up very significantly from 16.4 to 23.6%. Of course, so to date, that increase in contributions has been funded by government. Hopefully that will continue into the future. Perhaps worth pointing out that many independent schools have been reviewing their position in terms of the teachers' pension scheme, and some schools have withdrawn from the teachers' pension scheme and gone into additional arrangements, and an increasing number of independent schools are consulting on potential withdrawal from the scheme, particularly primary schools. So this, changes in terms and conditions may have an impact on the recruitment market. So I think the overall message here in terms of what I've talked about is very significant change. I think the world has been changing quite significantly before COVID. COVID has just thrown another thing into the pot. So that's enough from me. I'll hand over to Louise.
Thank you, Mike. Well, the second section of our report looks at income in detail reported in the 2020 accounts of the academies that we looked at for 19-20. Now, we know that pre-COVID, the government had pledged its support over the last 18 months extensively towards the educational sector. And in fact, the educational sector is now the third largest government budget. So we knew that Boris pledged in August 2019 funding of 14 billion over 3 years to boost English schools. So we were expecting to see an increase in income due to that pledge. We also had the teachers' pay and pension contribution grants of 426 million and 830 million, which was basically fully funding those increases that we knew were going to come through into your accounts. So we were expecting increased income, but then we had COVID. Now, during COVID, the government again pledged to support the schools while they were closed, and we had the introduction of the free schools meal income, which was originally due to end in the summer of 2020. But as we know, Marcus Rashford and his public campaign led to this being extended, and we now know that that will be extended to the 8th of March when schools will all reopen, as announced by Boris at the beginning of this week. So in the year to the 31st of August 2020, we can see the income that was expected from the government funding. MAT income per pupil had increased. So that was not unexpected in part, but it was then increased with the impact of COVID. And as Mike has mentioned, the downside of that was that the ancillary income has been reduced due to COVID. Rental and sports facilities have all been shut while the schools have been shut, having the biggest effect on the MATs in the secondary schools, because the secondary schools were closed for the longest period, giving obviously the greatest impact on that other income that has been lost. And COVID itself has led to a lot of additional funding that was unknown at the time of your budgeting for 19-20. We had the exceptional costs grant. Well, this is obviously quite limited, as Mike again mentioned. Now, you had to have forecast an in-year deficit in your school, not the trust, but in the individual school, to actually be eligible for that grant. Great grant if you can get it, but it did lead to limited availability of that funding. We also had the furlough income scheme, which we know wasn't applicable to teachers. However, trusts could use furlough income for other staff. So we have seen furlough income in some of our trusts to 31st of August 2020. We've then got future funding promises, and even on Wednesday, Gavin Williamson announced an additional 700 million for pupils to catch up. I'm not quite sure how popular the summer school option is for secondary schools to remain open in the summer, but it is obviously additional income that will be coming into schools. Governments have guaranteed minimum funding per pupils and a 10-year building programme, which was announced in June 2020, worth £1 billion. Now, historically, budget forecasts have been pessimistic. We've seen this year's results exceeding your budgets, and with all the government's future funding, hopefully we should see a better year in 2021. The question is, however, how can a trust accurately budget with so many variables and constantly changing? And managing budgets, which we will look at in a bit more detail later, is now crucial and critical to good management of any academy trust. So the third section that we're going to look at from our report is looking at the expenditure, starting with staff costs, which are obviously the main costs for all schools. Decisions now imperative for trusts include how resources should be spent, with staff costs being the largest spend. Staff costs are approximately 75% of your total costs, and that's comparable between maths, secondaries and primaries. We know that there are future pay and pension increases that have already been announced. We've got the 30,000 starting salary for teachers targeted 22-23. However, in November 2020, we had a public sector pay freeze announced by Rishi Sunak. Now, how this is all going to pan out, we're really just going to have to wait and see what happens. And again, it comes back to the question, how can a school accurately budget with so many moving variables? It was quite interesting in the results for the 19-20 year that the pupil to teacher ratio has remained unchanged. However, there was an increase in the staff cost per pupil, which reflects the increased pay and pension costs that we know about. So the next bit was looking at the non-staff costs, and non-staff costs are lower than prior years, not surprisingly. Now, is that COVID or is it better cost control? Is it a combination of both? Well, I think we all know the reality is that the school closures have led to most costs reducing, except for cleaning and PPE, i.e. COVID compliance costs that had to be increased and have probably never been spent before to make sure that the schools could remain open for the key workers' children and be ready to open as and when the government announced. The importance of management accounts and budgets has never been more highlighted than during COVID. Schools need to have accurate information to make decisions on up-to-date figures. We know that the budgets for last year were blown out of the water because of COVID, so the management account information had to be relied on to guide schools in what they could spend and what was actually available. So we need to make sure that when we're looking at costs, to avoid incremental increases, schools and academy trusts should be looking at the year in question, considering the needs and alternatives, rather than just adding 4% to last year's figure. So a trust must also have awareness for value for money. The ESFA still advise buying for schools and have identified thousands of pounds that have been saved by using that. And during the year, schools' resource management advisors visited schools, and for those visits, 94% were rated as good or very good, and they led to huge cost savings and identifying income generating opportunities. I believe the figure quoted was 30 million that had been identified, and to date 10 million has actually been saved. The other aspect of the SRMA visits were to identify optimal deployment of teaching and leaderships, and giving rise to savings in maintenance, catering and energy being the main area. Because of the success of the school's management advisors visits, more are being trained and will continue to assist trusts in ensuring that value for money is gained for each trust. At this point, we're going to have our second poll, and the question is, from your budget forecast, do you think your outturn for 2021 will be the same, better, worse or don't know? So do you think your actual results will be better, worse, the same, or don't know from what you forecast before the start of this year? Okay, we'll just give you a couple of minutes to post your answers. Just waiting for the results to be analysed and come through. Interesting. So we've got 17%, 50% better, and half of you are actually expecting your results to be better, and I would presume most of that is due to the COVID support that has been provided by the government, and obviously the lockdown from the recent lockdown from December that has actually led to increased savings in costs, which I guess are going to mirror what we saw in the latter part of 1920. So section 5 of our report looks specifically at multi-academy trusts. Now Mike's obviously already discussed a little bit about multi-academy trusts. This was looking at detail because the ESFA are still trying to promote multi-academy trusts. They're still trying to encourage SATs to join MATs where appropriate. Now the sector growth had slowed down during 1920. Now that could be due to COVID, or it could just be the maturity of the sector. The ESFA, as I said, are still pushing for the development of MATs, but the growth has definitely decreased in the year. And as Mike mentioned earlier, the rebrokerage again has reduced during the year. So the movement of schools from one trust to another trust is less than we've previously seen. And again, I think this could be due to the maturity of the sector, where the mandated moves have already been dealt with and those schools are now settled in the MATs that they have been put into. So MATs have moved towards full centralisation in 1920, so all their services being centralised, and fully centralised MATs we're seeing are larger than your average MAT with an average of 8 schools. We are still seeing a problem of schools in deficit being supported, and the problem with schools in deficit is that the deficit obviously goes to the trust. It doesn't belong to the school, it actually goes to the trust. So if you take a school in deficit, that deficit stays with you, whatever happens to that school in the future. And obviously a small MAT is going to have a higher risk of taking a school in deficit, where a large MAT probably can absorb that deficit without putting the other schools at risk due to its size. And following on from what Mike said about GAG pooling, we're now seeing that about 11% of schools are GAG pooling, which is an increase from last year. However, it is a slow shift and it's not as fast as we would possibly expect. 73% of MATs are using top slicing, with the remaining 16% using pupil numbers to allocate their GAG income. So 56% of the top slicing are using 5% as their top slicing of that income into their centralised trust for those services. So the next section is governance, and governance during COVID has been challenging to deliver efficiency. We know the ESFA are very conscious about governments and are putting increased responsibility on governance of trusts. And during lockdown, we have seen governance becoming virtual, like everything else, like today. We're all used to Teams and Zoom. And the good news is that in our report, most trusts reported that actual virtual governance hadn't affected the decision-making processes for most trusts. Most schools and most trusts were very capable of converting to virtual meetings. So virtual governance has transited from the old style of meetings, and I think it's something that we will see continue long after lockdown has been finished. We can see that local governing bodies are now very common in MATs, which has led to the MATs board itself becoming much smaller than for SATs. And during lockdown, this has actually proved really positive because it's allowed the MAT board to actually look at making centralised core decisions, looking at the provision of education and strategy, whereas the local governing bodies have been able to look at the implications of the day-to-day runnings of the schools, looking at reopenings, making sure that they are COVID compliant. So that structure is something that we're seeing evolve, and it has led to improved governance in the sector generally. We also identified that the role of members is important, and it has actually been increased because of the importance of keeping the members informed of board activities. So that is something, again, that was identified from our report. Recruitment, succession and skills of boards is still challenging. An ongoing assessment should be made of the skills you've got, identify any gaps, and try and actually look ahead to make sure that you are replacing the people and filling the gaps as you need. So shortages in financial management, school improvement and policy skills has been identified. Now, the Charities Commission actually recommends every 3 years there's an external review of governance. Now, that's a really good thing to do in a trust, just to have somebody external check who you've got as your governors and to make sure you are actually covering the full range of skills that are needed. And again, our report identified that diversity is a challenge for governing bodies and boards. It's very rarely achieved successfully, and ethnicity is underrepresented on most boards, so an ongoing challenge for most trusts. The themes for investigations and financial notices to improve, we've still got common areas being identified, which does include financial governance. So governance is still a very important area for the ESFA. And finally, internal assurance. Internal assurance has become increasingly important for all trusts, and the impact of COVID again has had an impact on the internal assurance work that trusts could do in 1920. Most has turned to virtual work, and some trusts have dealt with this much better than other trusts. It is an important area and is something that you need to make sure that you do address, as the financial handbook now says that internal assurance must look at all risks and not just financial risks. So trusts must be able to evidence consideration of a wider scope rather than just what was the old responsible officers checks that were previously performed. It's important as well to link your internal audit with your risk register. And it's quite important now, if you look at a risk register, pandemic seems to appear quite highly, whereas a couple of years ago, it was very rare to see pandemic on a risk register. Regular issues that have arisen from internal assurance that were identified in 1920 are the common ones, such as order authorisation, register of interest issues, and other compliance issues. And it's obviously been very difficult during COVID, where maybe working practices have changed, people have been working at home, to maintain those controls that would normally be in place in a working office environment. The role of the audit committee is very important and is one that shouldn't be underestimated, and it's an important link to the board to make them aware of what is going on. And finally, it's worth just mentioning that active risk management is important for all trusts to survive. So thank you very much. That's the end of my presentation. I'll hand you back to Mike.
Thanks very much, Louise. Some interesting observations I think there. I don't think I heard Louise mention that her husband is actually a head teacher, so she has seen many of these challenges, or at least I'm sure she's delighted she hasn't had to deal with them personally, but I'm sure she's given lots of support to her husband over the last year or so. Interesting comments there also about risk management. I think risk management can become a rather static topic. I think we have seen schools dealing remarkably well with the risks in relation to COVID over the last year and changing the way that they monitor and deal with those risks almost on a day-to-day basis at times. So we've had a couple of questions that have come through. The first relates to Louisa's last slide, which was the question of internal assurance, and the question is, we're a we're a secondary school, single academy secondary school. How many days internal audit should we have? Louise, I think you're the obvious person to deal with that question.
Thank you, Mike. There's not an exact number of days for any academy trust with internal assurance. It's a much wider scope now, and you need to obviously consider, as we said, the non-financial and financial aspect. But as a gauge, we would be looking to spend probably 3 days for a senior school with internal assurance on the financial controls, but they would be supporting the non-financial controls that you should be reviewing and checking in other methods. I said it now has to be a much broader approach. And I said it isn't one rule fits all, it's what suits your trust. But as a gauge, 3 days would be somewhere about average for that sort of work. And we are seeing a lot of trusts asking us for advice in this matter, and it's an area that we are looking at. And you may be interested to know that we will be benchmarking our internal assurance work with other Kreston firms in the same way as we have the annual accounts at the end of this year, when we've obviously got the data. So trusts will be able to compare and do a benchmark against other comparable trusts.
Thanks, Louise. The other question that we've had through is what's the best way of benchmarking my school? I think as I mentioned at the start, sometimes it can be difficult getting precisely comparable figures with other schools, but just a couple of observations on how you can do this. At the back of the benchmarking report, the data of around about 30 different ratios and categories is analysed by by primary schools, secondary schools, and multi-academy trusts. So have a look at that data, details averages and means and lowest and highest information, etc. But I think in many ways the best way of benchmarking, whilst you can do that analysis, sometimes it's hard to get complete comparability. But what considering these things can do is stimulate thought processes in terms of how you might be able to do things differently. So I would suggest doing that financial analysis, but also looking at some of the observations that we have made and suggestions that we've made throughout the report. The other observation in terms of benchmarking is it's often useful to benchmark within your local area. Now, the report does include some regional data, but it's often quite useful to compare with other academies in your area. So often there are little smaller groups, perhaps the school business managers, who get together to discuss similar issues. I think people are generally happy to share information, etc. So, I mean, I would encourage you to speak with other local schools and see what they're doing. I think we're just about then. I think we overrun slightly with the questions, but not too much over half an hour. Thanks very much for joining us. So you will be receiving an email with the slides, the presentation, and a link to the report. Do feel free to forward that information on to any of your colleagues or trustees, etc. We're very happy for anyone to see the information. So again, just finally, thanks Louise, thanks Lizzie, thanks everyone for joining us, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.